Hello guys and welcome to my new video, and today we're going to be talking about should you play the new Augmentation Evoker. Is it going to be fun for you? We're going to go through some of the gameplay, we're going to go through some of the positives, negatives, and how it might impact the meta in World of Warcraft. I got on to play a bit of Augmentation Evoker on PTR servers. I got to do some of the new dungeons, I got to try out the new playstyle, I got to try out the new class or the new spec, and honestly, I'm not 100% sold on this spec in terms of the fun, but I'm gonna go through the rotation, I'm gonna go through some of the good aspects, negatives, and let you decide if you enjoy this spec. Overall, I think Blizzard did a decent job because this is a first time Blizzard is doing a support or a bard type of class, and I think they're going to learn a lot from this process. But let's go and talk about the good and the bad. So this is my Augmentation Evoker, and I've been messing around with different talent builds on the PTR server, and the base rotation of this class at the very core is extremely simple. If you enjoy playing Devastation Evoker with things like Dragon Rage talent, you will see direct parallel similarities to Augmentation Evoker, because if you're playing Devastation with Dragon Rage, you activate this ability and then you have to use your empowered abilities in order to prolong your cooldown. So you have these windows which you need to optimize to a really min-maxy extent in order to increase your damage. Augmentation Evoker has something very similar, but instead of having a 2-minute cooldown, you have Ebon Might. So you can see right here, I'm not going to read through the spell summary, but this is going to be your main ability in terms of buffing your party. And this is, we'll talk about how to optimize in terms of, you can make sure that certain people get Ebon Might, because to some extent it is random, but there are hidden parameters in terms of which players get it. This is going to be your core ability, and then you have your mastery, which by default is going to, again, it's been nerfed, but casting an empowered spell grants shifting sands to one ally. It used to be 2, that got nerfed. Preferring damage dealers, increasing their versatility. So this is basically the core concept of the whole class. You're a buff class and you provide 2 major buffs in terms of Ebon Might and in terms of your mastery. You also have things like prescience as well, and we'll talk about this. This is going to be one of your core abilities. You also have Breath of Eon. That's going to be something that's going to require a lot of optimization, and this spell alone might actually change how the meta works, or what are the meta classes in Mythic Plus. But the default rotation, just to showcase how Ebon Might works, and it's very similar to Devastation Evoker's Dragon Rage, but instead of 2 minutes, it is a lot shorter cooldown. For example, you can see straight away that your Ebon Might ability is going to be extended. So you activate this ability, and then you want to make sure you're going to have these exact same windows where you optimize your abilities. Your empowered abilities are going to extend it, your things like Breath of Eons is going to extend it, your essence spenders like Eruption are also going to extend the duration of Ebon Might. You cast Ebon Might, and then you can see here, Fire Breath is going to extend this. You can see here your new empowered ability, Upheaval, is going to extend this Ebon Might buff. And you can see here your essence spenders like Eruption can also extend it. You get these windows where you press your Ebon Might and you need to make sure to extend this buff for as long as possible depending on what situation you're doing, and you can extend this by casting certain abilities. Now, if you activate Ebon Might and these abilities are on cooldown, you might be like, oh, I messed up, and you, again, Ebon Might will drop off and you might feel a little bit weird. We'll talk about this concept as well. Besides the aforementioned abilities, there's also a build, or you could have a build with Dream of Springs, which means that you're going to be losing, or how do we say, replacing some of your essence spenders in order to use it on Emerald Blossoms, because Emerald Blossoms is also going to cost essences, but it'll also extend the duration of Ebon Might, which might be considered one of those healer builds, not fully healer builds, but a build that's going to sacrifice your overall DPS for more healing, which might be useful in certain situations if you want to possibly drop a healer, or maybe healers need some help in, for example, some tyrannical bosses in Mythic Plus. So where does the complexity of the class come from? There's a lot of min-maxing that you can do with this class, because I think this does have a really high skill ceiling if you want to min-max it, because there are multiple cooldowns like time skip, causing your cooldowns to recover faster, which means that if you want to have Ebon Might available, you're casting your empowered abilities like Fire Breath, maybe your new empowered ability in terms of Heal, and then you're like, I'm gonna use time skip in order to reduce the cooldown of the abilities that I already used in order to use them again and extend my Ebon Might buff, because I need this right now. Everyone's popping their cooldowns. But again, this is a 3-minute cooldown, so you can optimize it every 3 minutes, but outside of that, your base rotation in order maintaining your Ebon Might is not overly difficult, and this is why I feel like this class can be very easy to pick up, but extremely hard to min-max, because your DPS as Augmentation Evoker is completely dependent on your party and if you can track their cooldowns. And this is where we come down to Prescience, another big talent that is going to be, I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, let me know, but either way, this is another big talent because not only is it going to provide additional crit to members in your group, but it also is a way to make sure that certain group members, let's say especially in raid environment, that they will get the buffs that they need, because Prescience, whatever, it's going to give you 3% crit and a bunch of other things to your party members. Its cooldown is lower than its duration, so you can do it or maintain it on multiple characters. So for example, keep in mind, Ebon Might doesn't really work with these NPC targets, but for example here, we're gonna apply Prescience on this character here. They have the buff here, you can see here, Mad Evoker is increasing your critical strike by 3% and a bunch of other things based on the talents that you choose. You can see the duration of this, 10 seconds remaining. My cooldown is about to come off and I can use this on this rogue. Now, if I use my Ebon Might, let's assume this is a raid environment. If I use my Ebon Might and it's going to affect multiple targets, it is going to prefer the targets that have prescience on them, which means you can control which 2 targets, or at least 2 targets in your raid, especially in your raid, because in a group environment it's going to affect, again, it's a lot easier, but in raid environments you can be like, hey, these 2 people, I'm going to make sure they have prescience on them and therefore they're going to have Ebon Might uptime or extremely increased Ebon Might, because your Ebon Might mechanics or preference, there's hidden mechanics on which targets it's going to choose in order to buff. Now let's talk about one of the most interesting things or additions to Augmentation Evoker that will probably shift the meta or change the meta, and that is going to be Breath of Aeon, which is going to replace Deep Breath. Initially, when reading about Breath of Aeon, I was like, okay, this is going to do some initial damage because it replaces Deep Breath, and I'll be playing Preservation Evoker, I've been playing Devastation Evoker. I assumed that this ability would do some initial damage. It doesn't really. This ability, think of it as something like a Cloudburst Totem, but for DPS, group-wide DPS. Because if you read through the tooltip, and we'll talk about optimization and things like that, but you fly through the targets, you basically fly through enemies, and you mark those enemies. And then for 10 seconds, again, it does say 11.4 seconds, that's because your mastery also increases this duration. But basically, for 10 seconds, temporal wounds accumulate 21% of the damage dealt by your allies affected by Ebon Might. And then it's going to critically strike for that amount as arcane damage. Your damage with Breath of Aeons is going to be, it basically can do insane amount of damage or basically no damage, because you need to make sure you maintain Ebon Might, you need to make sure your group members have cooldowns. So for example, if you're doing a Mythic Plus content and let's say you have a wonderful Shadow Priest in your group, and let's say Devastation Evoker. Shadow Priest has PI, again, you can use on 2 minutes. Devastation Evoker, again, these classes are very strong at 2 minutes and things like that. You're like, hey guys, do you have cooldowns? I have my Breath of Aeons. And they're going to be like, hey, we have all the cooldowns, we're the best 2-minute composition out there. You cast your Breath of Aeon on enemies, you mark them, you make sure your group party members have Ebon Might, and then your group pops off. They use all their cooldowns, they do as much damage as possible in that 10-second window, which is again prolonged by your mastery, and the amount of damage they do is going to be attributed to you. Breath of Aeon, because it is 2-minute cooldown, because it does require a lot of burst damage, could really change how you build your group around Augmentation Evoker. So just to showcase it a bit, I'm gonna cast Ebon Might, I'm gonna cast Breath of Aeon, and you'll see there's no initial damage here that happens, but it has a debuff on them. So if I do damage, you'll see here the accumulated damage, accumulated damage done, critical strike for a certain amount. So the more targets, again, you need to make sure Ebon Might is active, and all of the DPS that have your Ebon Might during your Breath of Aeons, they're popping off, they're doing as much damage as possible. You could possibly have one of the strongest 2-minute cooldown DPS compositions, depending on, again, which group composition you have, but you could have some insane ways to optimize this. If you're activating this when no DPS have any cooldowns, or DPS are not even sure that you have used your Breath of Aeon, you might do nothing. So this might be very unfriendly for casual groups who don't track cooldowns, and this might be extremely overpowered for groups who know exactly what's going on and plays around Breath of Aeons. And again, I'm missing out on some of the other abilities you can use in terms of blistering scales, in terms of other utility or more niche talents that you can pick up. Again, the talent build for Augmentation Evoker, the talent tree in itself has so many passive abilities, it's kind of interesting. But my general idea of Augmentation Evoker is that extremely simple core rotation that can be picked up pretty much by anyone, but in order to maximize your damage, it's going to require insane group coordination. You're going to have to install something like OmniCD if you're pugging content as Augmentation Evoker, because you need to know when your DPS classes have their cooldowns available. And in terms of other things that I noticed is that if you mess up your E-Bond Mind, for example, again, you want to cast your E-Bond Mind, you want to cast your empowered abilities, you want to make sure that the extension is going to be significant. But let's say you mess up and you don't really extend it. You didn't have your, for example, your empowered abilities were on cooldown, and then you're stuck with E-Bond Might's cooldown. You don't have this buff on the group, and you're just basically, what do I do right now? Do I cast Living Flames and Azure Strike in order to have a chance of Essence Burst? Because the more Essence Bursts I have, the more eruptions I can cast when I get my E-Bond Might available. Or maybe I have my Fire Breath available right now, but my E-Bond Might is on cooldown right now. Do I cast my Fire Breath? Do I hold it? There is going to be multiple ways to min-max your downtime in case you mess up your E-Bond Might, but it still felt a little bit like no man's land. What do I do in this situation? How do I optimize this? The rotation did feel a little bit lackluster when you mess up, but overall I still think this is a good attempt at the first class in terms of support and buffs. In terms of add-ons and add-on hooks in order to attribute the damage to Augmentation Evoker, the initial information from Blizzard that we have right now is that sites like Warcraft logs should be able to attribute damage to the Evoker themselves. So that means if you're a Warlock who's doing 10k more damage because you have Augmentation Evoker in the raid, that 10k damage is gonna go to the Augmentation Evoker, meaning they're going to climb in the DPS meters. Unfortunately, it's looking like in-game add-ons like Details might not have this functionality, and instead they're going to attribute the damage to the class or the DPS player, meaning that Augmentation Evoker overall damage is going to be a lot lower. This might cause some issues in more casual content, but for rank 1 pushers, they're going to know or use other tools in order to determine the true potential of this spec. And this is why it's going to be extremely painful in some cases to parse as Augmentation Evoker, because your damage is completely dependent on your group. Do you use Breath of Aeon at the right time? Does your E-Bond Might targets that get selected, again, it is somewhat random. We talked about Prescience or E-Bond Might preferring Prescience targets, and that is very, very important in raid environments, because you are going to use Prescience as a way to maintain strong buffs. E-Bond Might and your Prescience 3% crit on targets that will have the higher chance of providing most damage, because that damage is going to be attributed to your Augmentation Evoker. So I actually can see multiple people who want to parse as Augmentation Evokers hating the raid because, for example, you apply E-Bond Might and your target who has E-Bond Might during your Breath of Aeon dies or has to do a mechanic or doesn't pop their cooldown, your damage is going to plummet. And therefore, you have to be a sort of player who really enjoys this type of playstyle, because your damage is completely dependent, or a lot of your damage is dependent on your group, which either you're going to love or possibly absolutely hate. Now let's talk about meta in terms of the balance and in terms of the strength of Augmentation Evoker. I'm honestly really interested to see how Blizzard is going to balance this class, because a lot of people have been talking about the value of this class or the possibility of this class in terms of changing the meta, in terms of, again, you have Breath of Aeon in terms of 2-minute cooldown classes, you have a lot of optimization in raiding situations, things like that. Maybe Blizzard is going to choose to balance this class in such a way that, let's say a new player comes in and starts playing Augmentation Evoker, because you can cast Prescience or Prescience, whatever you say, you can cast this ability by just clicking it, and then it'll randomly assign it to a group member. You don't have to mouse over it and select a person that has cooldowns on them. Let's assume you're a new player, picks up this class, randomly clicks buttons, doesn't track other player cooldowns, doesn't really optimize this class. And let's assume that type of player, when using the right ways to evaluate the Augmentation Evoker, we talked about hooks and in-game add-ons. Let's say you're logging your Mythic Plus run, and Warcraft logs have ways of determining the potential of Augmentation Evoker, and this type of player does really well. That means that at the right hands, Augmentation Evoker is going to be absolutely overpowered, because if you have an organized group that plays around, again, things like Breath of Aeons that have target or optimal targets during optimal cooldowns, you have OmniCD in terms of maximizing or tracking everyone's offensive cooldowns. That class is going to be absolutely mandatory at high-end or rank 1 title pushes. So how does Blizzard approach? Do you make a class that is fun or interesting or viable to play for a casual player, and then disregard the fact that it probably be absolutely mandatory in high end? Because let's look at Power Infusion. Power Infusion at high end in terms of really, again, mythic content, in terms of high mythic plus pushes, the difference between a player that has Power Infusion and a player that doesn't can be absolutely massive if you assume that everyone has the same skill level. If you do end up playing Augmentation Evoker, let me know why you chose to play Augmentation. I actually genuinely feel there's going to be so many people flocking to this class, and I think after 2 weeks, a lot of the people are going to be like, the rotation is very simplistic, I don't want to track everyone's cooldowns, this class is not for me. Because you need to be someone who really enjoys the support role, and also, in order to min-max this class, your UI is going to be a very important aspect in order to maximize this class, because you need to track other player cooldowns in order to really get the most benefit out of it. Let me know how you feel about this. If you want to see more videos like this, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video.